So last week, I was not here, but you heard from John Wolf, our in-resident philosophy professor, and what he did was he introduced us to the story of Abraham. And I had kind of billed it as you're going to get this awesome example of this great person of faith, but that's how we think of Abraham. At least I think of him as someone who, first of all, was willing to move to a completely different land. He's 75 years old. And God says, I want you to uproot your family and the things that are yours from everything that's been familiar to you for the last 75 years and move to this undisclosed location that I'm going to reveal to you. And to me, that's a pretty big step of faith, right? And then we think of a story where God calls Abraham to offer up his only son, Isaac. And we think, well, that would take faith to be willing to give God your one and only son, right? That takes faith. But John acquainted us with the fact that Abraham, at closer look, is actually a really flawed individual in many different ways, not unlike us as people. If we look at humanity, if we look at ourselves, we honestly have to conclude that we're all kind of a mixture of good and bad to different degrees. And so he has some moments of faith, but he has some moments when he really struggles in different ways. And we're actually going to wade into one of those examples this morning, and we're going to discover what happens to Abraham when he is driven by fear. And here's the thing. I think this is something that for us is a whole lot more relevant than what we even realize. I would dare to say that a lot of times we make decisions based on fear. And I have seen throughout my experience working with churches that many times, even as church communities, decisions can be made out of fear. And I would propose to you that that might not be the best motivator in many circumstances. So we're going to look at Abraham's life today a little bit more, and a situation where he's fear-driven, and hopefully learn a lot from it in some practical areas of our lives too, and maybe avoid making decisions based on that motive in our lives, hopefully to avoid some problems that result from that. But I want to get you into Abraham's story, and John kind of filled in some of the gaps, pieces of Abraham's story last week, and so I'll read the beginning, how God gets a hold of him and calls him, and then we'll kind of segue into the verses we'll focus on this morning. But this is what it says. The Lord said to Abram, so his name starts out as Abram. God changes it to Abraham because of a different calling that God puts on Abram's life eventually. So Abraham, same guy. Sarai, his wife, Sarah, same lady, just a change of name to indicate a little bit of a change in purpose that happens later on. So it says, the Lord said to Abram, go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I'll show you. That's the step out in faith. I will make you into a great nation. That's pretty high billing. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great, and you'll be a blessing. So God makes some pretty amazing promises, right, to Abram in these verses. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. So there's some protection over Abram. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. I would love for God to make promises like this to me. That's amazing. Sounds like a wonderful future. So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had, and the people they had accumulated in Haran. That's kind of interesting. So he's got slaves. So maybe, as John alluded, there's some things in his life, even at this point, that are not maybe ideal. And they set out for the land of Canaan. And at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Do you remember us talking about Canaan a few weeks ago? Canaan was the son of Ham. And Ham was Noah's son, who perpetuated some abusive things against Noah or his wife. We don't know the details exactly, but we can kind of speculate. And so Ham and his son were known for their abusive nature and treatment of other people. And so when we see Abram being called into this land, our ears should perk up, because this isn't the greatest place to be led into from our human perspective. This is where God's leading him. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he enters into the land where the Canaanites are living, and God says, this is the place. That place I promised you, that I told you about, you've arrived. So Abram journeys by stages down to the Negev, which is the southernmost part of Israel. Just think the desert regions, kind of the wilderness. And so he's checking out this area stage by stage, and he's got a pretty large entourage and family and servants and all of that, livestock. And so he's just kind of traveling the land, getting an eye for the place that God has led him to and that God has promised to give to his descendants, kind of checking things out. A couple of terms that you might want to know headed into this. Abram means exalted father, which is kind of unique because he's not a dad yet. Sarai means princess. Negev, again, is the south part of Israel, the desert regions. Other words you're going to see in this story, you're going to see some words that you've seen before. If you've read Genesis, perhaps chapter 3, the story of God and the humans and the snake, and the humans coming up to this tree and the snake convincing them to eat from the tree of knowing good and bad, you're going to see a lot of similar vocabulary. The words know and see and beautiful and take. And this is all language associated with that first story of eating of the tree of knowing good and bad. And what you're going to see throughout Genesis is these words will come up in different stories, and it's supposed to teach us that this is going to be the same story all over again, just with different characters. And so as you're looking through this, you're going to meet a few people. You're going to see Pharaoh and the Egyptians. You're going to see, obviously, Abram and his wife Sarai. God's going to kind of be assumed to be in the picture. And so the question is, well, I wonder who, I'm going to assume maybe God is God in this story, but I wonder who the snake and the humans will be in this story. Will Pharaoh be the snake? Will Abram be the snake? How is this all going to play out? So kind of be looking for that as we go through the story as well today. So how can we tell if our decisions are driven by fear? And maybe mine are, maybe yours are today. Maybe a big decision that's before us, fear is a bigger factor in that than what we would imagine. That's what we're kind of after as we evaluate Abram's story. So 2 things that will help us see whether or not fear is driving our decisions. One is we can look at movement in our lives, and I'll get more specific. So it says there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because the famine in the land was severe. Now, let's think about this logically. You're traveling throughout this land that God's directed you to, but you're kind of in a desert region in the south, and there's a famine. Food is scarce. So logically, what's the next move? So Abram, again, it says here, he went to Egypt to stay there for a while. This is a very logical move, right? Egypt has food. This land does not have food. Doesn't take a genius to figure out what the next step should be. Just seems logical. But in this story, we're supposed to think about what God has already said to Abram. He said, and this is a review, we just read these verses a few minutes ago, go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land I'll show you. I'll make you into a great nation, and I'll bless you. So God says, go to this place, and if you go there, I'll bless you. I'll take care of you. And so maybe leaving to go to Egypt wasn't the best possible move, given what God had directed Abram to do. Now, think about this. God's operating with people in a desert area, and there's no food. Have you ever read anything about something similar in the Bible before? Are there any other instances where God's provided for people in a land that maybe doesn't have any food? What do you think of? You can respond. Exodus? Okay, what does God maybe specifically provide for people in a land without food? Manna. Yeah, manna is a great word. It means what is it in Hebrew? And it's this white flaky stuff that lands on the ground every morning that you can kind of make into a dough and bake bread out of. He also sends quail that just start dive bombing the camp about shoulder level in the evenings. So every night, every morning you've got bread, and every evening you just have to go outside and bat a few quail down, and you've got meat for dinner. I mean, it sounds like a hilarious picture, and I'm sure it would have been to actually be there. But this is what he's doing, and there's no water, and so God provides water out of a rock at one point and makes bitter water sweet. He does all kinds of things to take care of people in the place that he's called them to. And so if we're right where God wants us, maybe the best solutions aren't always outside of that area, even if to us maybe the most logical move would be to go somewhere else and seek something else. So we're seeing him move. And ultimately what's playing out in his heart, I think, is he's fearing a lack of resources. We're in this place God's led us to, but obviously there's not enough. And so I need to do something about this. I got to solve my own problem. And the answer is self-reliance here. God has directed me here, but God must not want me here because there's not enough, so I need to come up with my own solution. Instead of turning to God and saying, you led me here, you said you'd bless me, now can you provide me with some sort of food option? He comes up with his own solutions. And maybe sometimes we do that. There's a few times in this morning where I want us to kind of pull this into our lives and ask what this might look like in 21st century America, where you and I are living instead of in ancient Israel, or even pre-ancient Israel at this point in time in history. So it might look this way for us. You know, we might think something like, if I could just create enough income streams, like then I would be able to take care of myself. I'd be prepared for the things that'll come. If I can just build a large enough emergency fund, then everything will be okay. If I could just get enough insurance policies. I was walking through Costco the other day, and I passed by the stand for pet insurance. We have lots of pets, chickens, lizards, turtles, all kinds of things. I don't know if they qualify, but you can buy insurance for everything. I went to Home Depot this past week and got a product. I went to Walmart and picked up a cord to charge my iPhone, and there was an option for some insurance in case that would be damaged in the next 2 years. I could get a warranty, which is just another word for insurance, right? So there's so many things in our life, and we think, well, if my house is insured and all my appliances and all my products are insured and my pets are insured and I'm insured, we're good. Like, we're secure, right? Or if I could just fine-tune my investments, you know, if everything could be clicking and I've got, you know, enough in my investment portfolio, like creating other sources of income. Or if I could stock up on enough food and supplies. That's huge in our area, right, in Utah. We've got a big food storage, we've got enough supplies, so if something bad happens, we're good, right? And it's this idea of, you know, fear's kind of driving us toward independence and self-reliance, so we'll be ready for anything that comes. So maybe we're moving toward self-reliance, and that's one thing that kind of clues us in. Another way that we can tell if maybe fear is motivating us is sometimes we move toward deception. And you think about yourself, you're like, I don't deceive anyone. I'm not moving toward deception. Just wait, okay? Because this is a lot more nuanced than what we might imagine. It's a lot trickier to identify. So this is how Abram moves toward deception. It says, when he was about to enter Egypt, so he's going here to get more food, but again, fear is driving this guy. He said to his wife Sarai, look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. This lady must have been attractive because she's about 65 years old at this time, and he's super concerned. He says, when the Egyptians see you, they're going to say, this is his wife. They will kill me, but they'll let you live because you're this beautiful woman. So when we go to Egypt, please say that you're my sister. So things will go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account. I don't know if this strikes you as odd or not, but wives out there, if your husband said something like this to you, I want you to pretend that you're my sister. How would that sit with you? Really well, right? Now, if you read into the story, they're actually half-brother and sister. So Abram married his half-sister, which at that culture, I guess, was allowable. You know, to us, that would be kind of questionable in our society. But for them, maybe it's culturally allowable. So there is kind of a sense when he's, you know, it's a half-truth, right? But really, he wants her to pretend that she's not his wife. And so he's fearing his safety, and he's moving toward deception. I want you to deceive people so that I will stay safe. And I want to just parse these verses out just a little bit and clue in on a few key phrases because this might play out in our life in similar ways. So the first thing he says is, I know what a beautiful woman you are. So he's saying, like, my wisdom tells me that I'm aware of reality and exactly what I'm doing. Like, I know, I have wisdom. And maybe wisdom or presumed wisdom is a part of that slippery slope when we're being driven by fear. Like, we think, well, I've got it figured out. I know, my perspective is right. When the Egyptians see you, they will say. So he's predicting the future. Does he know how the Egyptians will respond at this point? He has no clue. He hasn't even stepped foot in their land yet. But he's predicting the future. And when we start to move in fear, oftentimes we start to lay out exactly what's going to happen. And as we do that, we're presuming most of the time worst case scenarios, right? They're going to kill me, but they're going to let you live. Well, how does he know that? He doesn't even know how they're going to respond at this point, but he's already gone down and presumed the absolute worst. I'm going to die and you're going to live and this whole thing is going to be over with. What did God promise Abram? To bless him, to make him into a great nation, to make him a blessing to all the people. He has completely forgotten about God's promises in this, and he's just driven by worst-case scenarios and presumptions, right? And then he pleads with Sarai to compromise, and fear oftentimes leads us into compromise and leads other people into that. And so it's going to start affecting her, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Whenever we move in fear, there's a cost, and normally it's to someone else and not necessarily always us. But how might this play out in our lives? How might we see ourselves moving toward more of a fearful motivation? It might look something like this. You know, God, I'm in this relationship right now, and I know it's unhealthy. I mean, I've had several people say, this is not a good situation for you. But if I move on from this relationship, I might never find someone else. So I'll just pretend that I feel loved. Or it might be completely opposite. I know this relationship is right for me, but I'm afraid of commitment, so I'm going to pretend like I'm unhappy and move on. It's fear-driven, right? If I change jobs, I might not have what it takes to be successful or financially stable, so I'm going to tolerate this stressful, less than ideal work environment. Okay? It's fear-driven. I know I'm overcommitted already, but if I say no, I'm going to disappoint someone. So I'm just going to pretend I want to get involved. Do you see how that's deceptive? Like it's actually fear-driven and we're deceiving ourselves. We don't admit it, but that's really what's behind this. If I confront this person or this problem, I'll cause offense, or maybe I'll lose a friend, or I'll ignite more conflict. So I'm just going to pretend like everything is okay. When we're pretending things, we're deceiving people or maybe even ourselves. If I expose my kids to other families who think differently, they might learn bad habits or adopt different beliefs. So I'm just going to pretend that they aren't resilient enough to handle it because I'm afraid of what might happen. So we're just going to insulate ourselves from other relationships. Maybe focus inwardly on just people who think the same way that we do. Okay? If our church welcomes various categories of sinful people, then our reputation as a church is going to be compromised, and our attendance will drop, so we're just going to pretend like we're living like Jesus, and we're going to do things to exclude certain groups of people or to make it highly uncomfortable for them to be a part of things. Okay? That's how fear can creep in to motivating us. Or if I volunteer at church, I might not have what it takes, or I might lose my flexible schedule because I've got plans a lot of weekends. So I'm just going to pretend that attending church, that's enough. But I'm going to tell myself that's what being a faithful Christian is, showing up on Sundays, right? But not getting too involved. So that's how that might play out. So how can we tell if our decision is driven by fear? One, we can look at movement. Are we moving toward self-reliance or moving toward deception, self-deception even in different ways? But secondly, we can look at mistreatment. Oftentimes when we're motivated by fear, somebody else gets run over in the process. And that's what we see happening to Abram's wife specifically in this situation. It says, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw. Do you see those key words, right? The humans, they saw the fruit, right, on the tree, that it was good, that it was beautiful. So we're like, oh, I see this story cycling again. So the Egyptians are like the humans in that story in the Garden of Eden. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, so the woman was taken into Pharaoh's household. Just like the humans took the fruit of the tree, Pharaoh takes Sarai, right, into his household. He treated Abram well because of her, and Abram acquired flocks, herds, male and female donkeys, male and female slaves, and camels. So here's what's happening. Abram's fear-driven actions, they actually cause him to benefit, but it's at Sarai's expense. Wives, again, can you imagine if your husband's like, why don't we just pretend that you're not my wife and we let you be taken into some other household so you can become someone else's wife for a little bit of time so I can financially benefit from that. How about we do that, right? Again, not a lot of takers out there. But in this culture, that's what Abram persuades his wife to do. Now, a couple things about this culture, again. First of all, whenever our decisions are motivated by fear and self-preservation, others pay the cost. Okay, that's just something that oftentimes happens. But here's what's happening with Abram culturally. So when he comes in town and he says, I'm the older brother of this woman, Sarai, he's the one that is the guardian figure over this woman. And so what Pharaoh does is he purchases Sarai for one of his wives with lots of camels, lots of slaves, lots of livestock as a dowry, right? So he purchases the sister from the older brother because the father is no longer in the picture. He's already passed away. And he buys Sarai as a part of his harem. That's what's happening culturally. It's just a huge dowry because he's the Pharaoh. He's the king of Egypt. And so he pays this huge amount of wealth to Abram. But meanwhile, Sarai is now taken into Pharaoh's household and forced to become Pharaoh's wife. And the story doesn't fill in the lines, but we're led to believe that that means everything that you would assume that would mean in this story. So she's probably treated like Pharaoh's wife in different ways. So how might this kind of thing play out in our culture? Again, where we actually end up mistreating people because our decisions are fear motivated. Well, how many of you lived through COVID, right? And I have to be careful on this one because it gets personal, right? I remember walking into Costco for probably, 3 or 4 weeks, just hoping and praying that there would be another case of toilet paper in stock. Because this thing happened where people started panic buying. And the logic was if we don't buy 12 cases of toilet paper, we might run out if we don't get any more in until next year, right? But panic buying is really self-preservation at other people's expense. And I know because it was me who was tearing off single sheets of toilet paper to make it through, or just taking a few more showers than normal, right? Just being real, okay? It affected me. I'm trying not to stay bitter. I think I've moved on. Right? But other people's fear, it hurt me, okay? If I don't put enough restrictions on my child, he or she will do something that will embarrass me as a parent. Again, full disclosure, I have felt this way many, many times, right? But maybe if I'm parenting in too strict of a way, I'm being super controlling as a parent, what I'm doing is preserving my own reputation at my child's expense because life is just a list of rules because dad's afraid you're going to do something that's going to make people think poorly of him as a parent, okay? If I don't put enough restrictions on my spouse, he or she might hurt me, or they might just try to make decisions or pursue experiences that are outside of our budget or outside of my comfort zone. We might have to travel. I hate traveling, those kinds of things, right? And so we're going to just try to control our spouse. But that's really self-preservation at someone else's expense, right? If we don't limit the number of shelters and rehab facilities and other resources like this food pantry that we just built out in front of our church that Ray and Julie completed over this past week, right? If we don't limit those kinds of opportunities, our community is going to be overrun with homeless people and drug users and mentally ill. But that is a lack of compassion that's really self-preservation at someone else's expense, namely all the people in our community who need those resources. So we can't act in fear. I mean, we can act in fear, but it's not a wise course of action. If we don't deport every illegal immigrant, then our nation will become overrun with crime and our American ideals will be compromised with foreign cultural influences. So, as a follower of Jesus, I recognize we have people on so many different lines of things politically, different political parties. Many of you highly support different political parties. And so I'm speaking kind of outside of that realm in terms of just Scripture. If you look at the Old Testament in particular, you'll see a God who's very concerned about people who are in the midst of Israel who are from other nations, right? And at the bottom line, you'll see a God who considers every human to be an image bearer and representative of himself. And so we kind of have to think outside of the way that we think as Americans sometimes to view people as God's image bearers who are supposed to represent him throughout the earth, right? We're all of equal value in a sense. And so some of the ways that we tend to act as Americans kind of butt up against these realities of how God views people. And sometimes we see ourselves leaning toward prejudice and discrimination in different ways. But really, that's self-preservation at other humans, right, expenses. And we have to be careful not to see people as categories, but to remember that people are humans. And so these kinds of things can even play out, in our culture in the way that we treat people. I think this is valid, okay, when it comes to fear. Do political parties ever intentionally fuel our fears to convince us to support their agendas? Do you think that politics ever capitalizes on fear? So if you watch the news and if you listen to politicians speak, I guarantee this will pop. If you've never noticed this before, it happens all the time from all the different political parties. No matter how you vote, people are trying to persuade you with fear. And I would caution you against using that as a motive, as a believer, to make your decisions, even your political ones. Make them for other reasons, but don't make them because somebody is motivating you with fear tactics. Okay, we just need to be aware of this because it's really everywhere in our society. It says, but the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarai. So God steps in here and he acts to change the circumstances. So Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? So we don't know how he connects the dots, but after the plagues start coming in and just all these bad things happening, he starts asking questions, and eventually maybe it's a situation, where she comes forward and Sarai says, hey, I might know why all this is happening. We don't know. But Pharaoh figures it out. Why did you say she was my sister? So I took her as my wife, right? That word take again. So he has taken her as his wife. Now, here's your wife. Take her and go. It says Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all he had. So he did walk away with quite a lot of wealth as a result of this. But it did not go well. And again, it causes him to benefit at the expense of not just Sarai, but also Pharaoh's entire household. They have to deal with God's judgment falling on them so that Pharaoh will realize what's happening. And if you remember, God told Abram, I will make your name great. But out of fear, Abram thought he had to make his own name great. And so he does things to increase his wealth and protect his safety on his own. He relies on himself. But he also says you'll be a blessing. Now, if your decision and your fear is the result of someone's household being plagued, do you think you're a blessing to them? Probably not, right? All the earth will be blessed through you. Well, I guarantee you, Pharaoh and his household, as they're going through these plagues, whatever those are at the moment, they don't feel very blessed by Abram. And so everything that God desires to do is unraveling, and it's affecting lots of people because Abram's driven by fear, okay? So God intends for Abram to be a blessing again, but it causes Abram to become more like a curse, right? And he does gain resources. He does make his own name great, but they end up causing more problems. In fact, Abram has a sketchy relationship with Hagar, one of Sarah's servants in the future, and Hagar is an Egyptian. And how do you think she entered into Abram's household? It was through all this exchange. So further things happen in the future that trip him up because of his poor choice in that instance, in that situation. So again, as we recap and kind of close things off, how can we tell if our decisions are being driven by fear? We can look at movement. Are we heading towards self-reliance? I have to come up with my own solutions. Or maybe even worse, deception, starting to deceive others or even myself. We can also look at mistreatment to see if our fear-driven actions are causing us to benefit at another human's expense, right? Because ultimately, all of us are these human image bearers of God, right? But sometimes our fears, they cost someone, and it's normally not us, but it wreaks havoc on other people. Other people get caught up in the wake. Here's a few conversations that you might think about personally or start with other people, maybe your family, or if you're together with another maybe believing family or something this week. But what is one big decision that I'm currently facing and what's motivating that? Maybe you don't have anything at the moment, but maybe that something comes to mind pretty quickly. Like, here's what we're deciding. Me as an individual or us as a family, we're definitely on the cusp of making this decision. But really, why? Is fear a part of why you're making the decision that you're thinking about making? Secondly, am I moving towards self-reliance or deception with that decision? Or does the decision-making process, am I involving community in it? Am I getting other outside advice? And am I trying to be honest and just straightforward and transparent, with myself and with other people in that decision? Third, how are others being impacted by my decision? Am I benefiting at someone else's expense? That's a great question. As we look at our decisions, who's winning and who's losing here, right? And are we just running over people in the process? And sometimes it's tricky because in some decisions, you're like, these people are winning and these people are losing, right? And so you kind of have to weigh it out and say, am I considering the best interests of everyone involved, right? Because my kids don't always agree with my decisions that I make, right? Or that Christine makes. But we're trying to consider the best interests of everyone who's involved in the process. So we're thinking big picture, right? And when we're not, when we're fear-driven, we're thinking, what's in my best interest, but who cares about how this affects other people? So are we bringing that, how other people are affected into our decision-making and our awareness? Lastly, how is fear affecting the way I plan, or the way I date, or the way I parent, or the way I lead, or the way I work, or the way I relate with my spouse, my family members, or the way I retire, or the way I think about volunteering? Those are just some practical areas where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. How would faith motivate me to act differently in those areas than fear perhaps is or has been? So all those are ways that we can consider whether or not we're being driven by fear in our decisions. Let's go ahead and pray as we wrap things up today.